Good evening, our distinguished guests. Thank you for joining us this evening for our special learning session hosted by Kingsgate Advisors Institute. Welcome you all, our distinguished guests, our guest speakers, esteemed practitioners, scholars, researchers, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us once again this evening. My name is Oluwambe Pelumi, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of Kingsgate Advisors Institute. On behalf of the Institute, I welcome you all to this important webinar titled Economic Policy in Fragile and Conflict-Affected States. As we gather here, it is vital to recognize the urgency of this conversation. It is important that we discuss one of the most important factors affecting us, particularly countries in Africa and beyond. According to the World Bank, by 2030, we will have nearly 2/3 of the whole world's extreme poor living in fragile and conflict-affected states. This context, marked by weak institutions, instability, and economic disruptions, makes policy design very difficult, makes implementation very challenging, and even more complex. So it is in this context that we set this webinar. Yet it is also in this very environment that most innovative and creative solutions that are able to transform the economic landscape and even the economic outcome, that is what is most needed. Now at Kingsgate as an institution, we are committed to being more than a research hub. We are building capacity and nurturing the next generation of change agents. Earlier this year, we launched our Young Scholar Academy, aimed at equipping young economists with skills to become policy entrepreneurs and social practitioners. We strongly believe that those with the lived experience of fragility must have a seat at the table in shaping responses to fragility and conflict solutions for recovery and transformation. So today's learning session is part of that mission. And over the course of our discussion, we will explore important topics such as the political economy of fragile states and the role of inclusive institutions. We would also explore how fiscal and monetary policy tools can be adopted to uncertainty. We'll identify some pathways for institutional resilience and state building, and we'll also pinpoint some critical importance of centering gender, inequality, and displacement in policy priorities. So our expectation is that at the end of this discussion today, you would not leave just with deeper knowledge, but you will be equipped with practical insights that will make you and help you take action in responding to these critical challenges that we face in fragile context. So whether you're a policymaker, a researcher, or a practitioner, or even a young economist, this is time to relax and also take your notes, start penning down your questions. At the end of today, we would have a Q&A session where our guest speaker will attend to some of the burning questions that we have and some issues that are raised during the discussion that would want clarity on. We'll be privileged to have the opportunity. So once again, I thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to an engaging and thought-provoking discussion with us all this evening. And the way to start, I would like to bring up the keynote speaker. It is my honor to invite Professor Adeola Adenikiju to deliver his keynote speech. But before he does that, I would like to just read out his profile so that we can all have an idea of who is going to be speaking to us in the next 3 minutes maximum. So Professor Adeola Festus Adenikiju is an internationally recognized economist and a policy advisor with over 30 years of distinguished service in academia, public policy, and international development. He is a professor of economics at the University of Ibadan, where he serves as the pioneer director of Center for Petroleum, Energy Economics and Law. He is also a research professor at the Center for Econometrics and Allied Research. He is the 44th president of the Nigerian Economic Society and the chairman of the Board of Advisors and a distinguished fellow of Kingsgate Advisors Institute. With expertise in macroeconomic modeling, energy economics, and sustainable development, Professor Adenikiju has contributed significantly to Nigeria's economic transformation agenda. He has served on numerous presidential and ministerial committees, and he has also worked with leading multinational institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and even the African Development Bank, just to mention a few. His research and consulting engagement spans macroeconomic policy, energy access, natural resource management, and regional development strategies. Professor Adenikiju is deeply committed to mentoring the next generation of African economists, and he has supervised over 200 MSc dissertations and over 15 PhD theses. His academic excellence, public service, and policy leadership has earned him numerous national recognition, including listing among Nigeria's top 50 professionals and several awards from students, professionals, and professional organizations. So, ladies and gentlemen, this evening, please make me welcome Professor Adenikiju for his keynote speech. You have the floor, sir. Good evening.
Thank you so very much, Director. Yeah, it's good to be here. And, I want to also welcome Dr. Ali, the Head State Fragility Initiative International Group Center, the UK. Distinguished practitioners, researchers, scholars, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be here today and to be the one that will deliver this keynote address on a very, very important subject, economic policy in fragile and conflict-affected states. According to the World Bank, and going by the data that Dr. Pelumi Olanu cited earlier on, almost 2/3 of the world's extreme poor will live in the fragile and conflict-affected countries by 2030. So it's a major problem, okay? And the problem also is magnified by the fact that many of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East and North Africa are classified as, conflict-affected countries. Actually, Africa hosts more than 50% of countries that are regarded as conflict-affected, fragile states. And another data also shows that, nearly 73% of African countries, have been in and out of fragility, since that concept, was developed. So it's a very serious problem. And, it's something that should attract our attention. And I'm glad that that is something that we are looking at today. It's also interesting to know that Nigeria is number 10 on the list, of fragile states, So what are the unique features of these fragile states? One of the unique features that we find out is that per capita incomes in those countries are on the average 50% lower than other developing countries. There's also widespread poverty, extreme poverty in those countries. And then also the per capita income growth since 2020 has been in negative territory, So, so you have very high poverty, low growth, and basically these are countries that are, are facing a lot of economic challenges. And in Nigeria, like I told you, Nigeria is number 10, is classified as fragile. Fragility is not uniform nationwide. In some parts of the country, especially the Northeast and the Northwest, you have significant impacts of fragility, and that is due to the conflict and insurgency in those parts of the country, but it's not equally, the same over the country. So, what are the policy initiatives that can help us to address some of the problems of fragility? One of the areas that have been identified is building inclusive institutions. Okay, countries that are able to build inclusive institutions are able to quickly address the problems associated with fragility. We see an example of Rwanda. Rwanda was able to, get out of the problems, that came up because of the genocide, and were able to revamp, tax administration in the Rwanda, such that the tax revenue to GDP ratio rose from under 10% in 2000 to nearly 60% a decade earlier. Now, that provided the government with the fiscal space that helped them to make major investments in the area of health and education. And we must also commend what Nigeria is trying to do now by establishing these development commissions across the 6 regions. In the Northeast, we have the Northeast Development Commission, and basically this was to complement what our government is doing in the areas of providing infrastructure, like constructing schools, providing healthcare facilities, and other infrastructure that are needed in conflict affected areas. The other areas of intervention possible is adapting fiscal and monetary tools to fragility. How do we, adapt fiscal and monetary tools to fragility? In other words, there's a need to go beyond the traditional instruments, of taxes, and monetary, controls, monetary easy or monetary control, in order to address fragility. Other, measures like conditional cash transfer, food support, and public works are areas of intervention that states may also want to look at. Then it's also very important to be able to invest in the capacity of the state itself. When the state is weak, then there's going to be a problem of fragility. When the state is not able to provide the necessary, what we call in Nigeria dividends of democracy, then there's problems. If it's able to protect its environment and its borders, protect its borders, and take care of conflicts quickly, then you have problems of fragility and conflicts. So you need a very strong state, resilience, to be able to ensure that it meets the basic needs, provides security for the people, and provides the resources that is required for people to be able to make decent livelihood. One other area that is also very important is to address equity, gender, and displacement. Okay, so issues around the because again data has shown that women, and children are always the ones most impacted, by conflicts and other associated source of fragility. So there's a need to define, to design instruments that are able to take care of those vulnerable groups of people. Microfinance, vocational training, agricultural support programs, to focus particularly on these very vulnerable groups, the women and the children, to empower them so that they're able to withstand, and stand strong when you have conflict. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's also very important that the international support system be there. Okay. Now, the fiscal space in many African countries is very small. Okay, these countries are poor, their ability to mobilize domestic resources is very limited. And therefore, there's a need for complementarity from international donors, multilateral agencies, and governments. This is not a time to withdraw aid and support for these countries. It's a time to actually find a way of increasing those support, because these countries are buffeted by all kinds of challenges, fragilities, including climate change and the rest of them. So it's very important that we design international support for them. So I'm excited to be here today. I'm sure like many of you are, to listen to our experts, take us through, the various facets of these issues, and more importantly, how those issues can be addressed. So fragility threatens not only the lives of billions, but also the long-term development trajectory of economies and the collective aspirations of achieving the sustainable development goals by 2030. Our task me and you as economists, policymakers, and scholars is to ensure that theory translates into practice and that practice translates into tangible change for the billions living at the margins of conflict and poverty. So let's sit down, let's listen to this great talk today, and I look forward to it. And let's also be able to ask questions when that times arise, so make some contributions that will make all of us better off. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you for that keynote speech. And like Prof has said, pen down your questions. It's going to be a very interesting ride. Dr. Abdul is here. Our guest speaker is actually here, and I'll bring him up in a minute. So before then, I would just like to read from us in the chat session. If you can chat us, let's know where you're joining us from. Are you from Nigeria? If it's from outside Nigeria, and even if it's in Nigeria, let's know where you're joining us from. It's important we meet you, so you can just do some brief introduction in the chat session, and also start taking notes of your questions. Very soon we'll allow you on mute and share your question. But before Dr. Abdul starts, let me just introduce him by reading his bio. We are moving into the gist of today's matter, which is the presentation itself, the lecture itself. So Dr. Abdullahi Ali is the head of State Fragility Initiative at the International Growth Center in the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he leads the initiative strategy and oversees its work with governments of fragile and transitioning states at national, regional, and global levels. In his role, he ensures the quality and effectiveness of SFIs, that's State Fragility Initiatives, SFIs engagement, including national level policy support, the development finance institutions, fragility forums, and thematic work on scaling up investment in energy access in fragile settings. Dr. Ali brings significant experience from both academia and the public sector. He previously served as the executive director and chief economist of the Central Bank of Somalia, where he led the monetary, fiscal, and regulatory policy group and was part of the bank's senior management team. In November 2022, he was appointed by the President decree to the advisor to the National Economic Council in Somalia, where he continues to serve as a national economic advisor. In this capacity, he works closely with the council members, government officials, and international partners and development stakeholders to shape Somalia's economic strategies and policies. Between 2023 and June 2025, he led a team that developed Somalia's CV 2060, a strategy in collaboration with the NEC colleagues, focusing on long-term economic recovery, stabilization, and inclusive growth within the Somalian economy. Dr. Ali holds an MSc in development economics and a PhD in economics from University of Manchester. His career reflects a deep commitment to advancing economic resilience in fragile and conflict-affected states, combining rigorous evidence-based research with practical policy making for transformative impact. So today we are going to hear directly from a scholar practitioner, and that's really a big deal for us in the academy, because the essence is we are training young economics policymakers that tomorrow will be scholar practitioners that will sit at the table to make important decisions that would affect the growth and transformation of economies, not just Nigeria, within the global south. So ladies and gentlemen, I think welcome with me, Dr. Ali. Good afternoon or good evening, sir, and thank you for joining us today. We are pleased to have you here. So you can go ahead and start sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Great to be here. Grateful for the Kingsgate Advisories Institute for inviting me, and for the professor for that insightful keynote. Great to be here. And ladies and gentlemen, please mind me, because I will try to keep this as short and sharp as possible, so we can have more space to discuss. So let me start with some basic definitions so that we are all on the same page. Already the professor also alluded to some of the main characteristics of these fragile states. And then we will kind of narrow down into some real structural and macroeconomic challenges. And then on the basis of that, we are going to discuss some of the main policy objectives we want to pursue, and then the toolkits we may use. And then, of course, there are certain constraints which I'm going to highlight. And then I just want to warn that as I'm explaining these things, these are basically a menu of options. It's not designed for all fragile contexts. The key lesson that I want to impart, because we need to be very practice-oriented, is to ensure that we are as adaptive as possible. In fragile contexts, you have various challenges and the environment is moving rapidly. So therefore, you need to be adaptive and flexible. So that's what I'm going to emphasize. And then in the end, of course, we would have some Q&A. So very quickly, so that we have the same understanding, how do we define fragility, right? So there are two broad definitions. One is relatively narrow, and this is based on the World Bank classification. And the starting point there is on the state, in terms of the capacity of the state and the institutions and governance capacity of the state to deliver effectively its key functions. We're talking about economic development, social development, maintaining peace, and so on and so on. According to this definition, we are talking about around 40 to 41 countries globally now. But the definition that we prefer, and everybody in this particular sector prefers, is the broader definition, which is the OECD definition. According to the OECD, fragility is multidimensional construct. It has 6 dimensions, from economic side to environmental, and so on, to political, security, and so on and so on. And the idea here is it's when there is a higher propensity for shocks and risks, but at the same time, the state or the system and the community does not have the capacity to manage or absorb or mitigate those shocks. Now, one thing that a lot of countries, around 61 countries, according to the OECD, have been classified as being fragile. So 15 of them or 16 of them are extreme fragile, right? On the right-hand side, you'd see that fragility has a persistent to it. Actually, it's very difficult to escape from it. You would see that roughly 75% of the countries stay within fragility more than a decade, right? So between 2006 and 2023, over 75% of the countries have stayed in fragility. So on the slides, you can see some numbers, and those numbers are basically correspond to the sources. So you would find those sources at the back, just for you, for those of you who are interested in the more technical side of things. So already the professor alluded to these numbers, so I'm going to just summarize the broader context of fragility here. We know that over 70% of the world's extreme live in fragile contexts. By the year 2040, according to the OECD, practically all extreme poor countries would be living in these contexts. Just 2 things I want to emphasize in that not all fragile countries face conflict, but there is some sort of latent conflict, not necessarily active conflict, but there is some sort of latent conflict. Food security is a big issue. And then most of the young people, as you know, in fragile contexts, over 70% of the population are below the age of 30, and they are not being utilized more productively in terms of education, training, and so on and so on. Now, one key element that we understand is that in these contexts, fragility tends to interact with a lot of other challenges, particularly climate, high social polarization, displacement, and so on and so on. But at the same time, the capacity of the state is relatively weak. Rule of law doesn't usually exist, or it's relatively challenged, and basic services are not delivered. So this all kind of leads to an environment where economic development is not a top priority given the challenges, and policy implementation faces all sorts of challenges. So a lot of figures here, but it's relatively straightforward. I'm just trying to underline the human cost of fragility, right? So if you look at the top one, these are from the World Development Indicators. These are data that I've figures that I've created. You can see that, for example, because here what I'm doing is I am comparing fragile contexts with low-income countries, right? Because that's the benchmark. You can see that more than 10 million people are forcibly displaced relative to low-income countries. Can you imagine 10 million more? Internally displaced people, more than 7.2 million people are displaced in FCS relative to low-income countries. 1.4 and so on and so on. I mean, you get the point. Net migration or brain drain, again, in FCS, higher, more than 750,000 people, right? Life expectancy, 7 years less. Infant mortality, double. So the idea here is that fragility presents additional layer of misery, right? It's not simply being poor, but you have an additional layer of misery. Extreme poverty is one of the main characteristics, as we already established. And conflict and fragility are highly correlated, and conflicts usually associated with around 20% in terms of loss of economic development, in terms of per capita income within 5 years. Think about natural resources. Again, fragility is highly correlated with that. For example, in South Sudan, 95% dependent on natural resources. Fragile countries receive less ODA, less aid, because there is conflict usually, and they are not usually high priority, and also there is less absorptive capacity, right? FDI does not go to those places, as you can see in the figure there. The state itself, in terms of revenue mobilization, in terms of fiscal institutions, very weak, as you can see the numbers. And on the right-hand side, I've shown the effect of conflict on per capita GDP. And across many different studies, some of them rigorous studies, RCTs and others, you can see that significant losses in per capita income. Just to give you an example, in 2011, Syria lost 60% of GDP in just 1 year. In 2023, if I just give you another example, Sudan had 350% inflation rate just because of the conflict, and so on and so on. So it is not in a good place to be, fragility, that is. So now we have established what fragility is, and we're saying that it's literally the definition of human misery in terms of both economic side, environmental side, human side, political side, societal side. Across the board, you have these mutually reinforcing miseries, and they tend to kind of reinforce one another. Then the question becomes, as countries become trapped in fragility, we know that they will stay in fragility for many, many years, perhaps over a decade. So what can we do as policymakers? So here I have a framework, a very simple framework. And what we are saying is, given fragility, we need to think about policy objectives that we want to pursue to mitigate and minimize the effects of fragility, and over time escape from fragility. So that's what are those policy objectives? I'm going to show you in a moment. For each policy objective, we want to pursue some policy toolkits. Those policy toolkits must be context specific. We cannot copy it from the US or the UK. It has to be context specific. We will discuss some of them, and the professor already alluded to some of them. Then they need to enable us. There are certain constraints, unique constraints. How do we navigate those constraints? And then we need to use some evidence-based solutions, because we know that the making a mistake is costly here, right? Fragility means that you have competing priorities, resources are limited, time is limited. Therefore, we need to be really focused on what works, not what we copy from somewhere else. So I'm going to try to use this particular framework and show you some particular solutions that we could use. Two things, as we are discussing these policy objectives and this particular 4 domains, we have to remember 2 things. Number 1 is, of course, conflict sensitivity. In other words, we must make sure that whatever intervention we put in place does not make things worse, right? So because the political economy is different here, we have to have contextual understanding what we are dealing with. I was part of the team in Somalia that I was one of the technical leads that led to the debt relief program. We managed to bring Somalia's debt from 68% to around 4%. We did so many reforms, but we made a number of mistakes because we were always trying to, try to copy from somewhere else. It doesn't work. So a lot of costly mistakes, which I'm gonna allude to later on. So what I'm saying is, do no harm. Conflict sensitivity is key as we are using these different elements. Localization are important. That means local actors must own the process. Donors are everywhere, but we need to use that. The people that are in this session, they are the key. Basically, you need economists, you need change makers who really care about their own country to be there. So we need to localize. We cannot have consultants from Washington that come and do some sort of a off-the-shelf solution. They will not work. Now, finally, we know that there are contextual issues. I already alluded to them. There are common macroeconomic and structural features that we must navigate. I've already mentioned some of them, and the professor already mentioned some of them. Now, the policy space is different in terms of decision making, because here the political actors are different. Their priorities are different. They are operating in a contested environment. When you're operating in a contested environment where there is social polarization is significantly high, where there is perhaps conflict, you have to know that credibility is low. Donors are there, and donors usually are a big headache. They come with some solutions, but they add to the complexity of what we are facing. Usually, even when we implement good policies, you have to understand that there will be policy capture or regulatory capture, sometimes even a state capture of some sort, corruption or rent-seeking behavior. So what I'm saying here is we are facing governance constraints. So therefore, the policies we design must use a rule that says we have to be very adaptive. In other words, we have to adapt to the environment we are operating. The horizon we have is not that much, so we have short-term decision making. That means we can make mistakes. We have to accept it. And you have to also accept that we need to be deliberate in the decisions we make in terms of mitigating risks. Basically, what I'm saying here is every decision we make, every intervention we make, we have to think in terms of additionality, for example, conflict sensitivity and localization, and so on and so on. So now, how do we overcome fragility given that those 3 big problems we faced? We have structural and macro problems. We face policy or governance constraints. What do we do? How do we approach? So here we have a vast literature. On the right-hand side, I'm using the OECD's state building framework. According to the OECD, we have to start from legitimacy, and then, of course, the capacity of the system and the state, and then the authority in terms of delivering change, and then we have to build resilience. At the end of the day, fragility is about not only facing shocks, but how do you build the resilience needed to cope, the coping mechanisms? How do we strengthen those? Now, the OECD framework is not designed for economists. This is a political economy framework. So on the right-hand side, I've actually translated that to those of you who are economists, right? So resilience means macroeconomic reforms, right? So we need, our primary overarching policy objective is we need to deliver some macroeconomic reforms. Stabilization means authority, basically. That means we have to stabilize not only the economy, but also society, the climate side, the human capital side. We have to do some sort of interventions that kind of arrests the fragility trap, that makes sure that we are at least mitigating the fragility trap. Again, but of course, we need to do some sort of social protection, some sort of service delivery. And this is what the professor was talking about. We cannot simply rely on macro reforms. We need to think about those that are vulnerable. We need to build social capital of some sort, social contract of some sort. And then ultimately, the base is legitimacy. We need to have some quick wins, and that is what we call institutional building. So I've just translated that into an economist's language, but the framework is identical, basically. So now, how do we do resilience or macroeconomic reforms? What policy toolkits we have? Well, we have the traditional ones, of course, but they are riddled with challenges. In Somalia, when 2017, when we started the challenge, we didn't have anything, so we tried to build from scratch. Other countries have done what the miracle that Rwanda managed to do, to build that fiscal space. So anyway, we have these policy toolkits, but the challenge is given by that graph there. You can see the figure. In fragile and conflict states, you have institutional and economic governance challenges, right? Relative to low-income average, these countries have an additional burden of fragility. So in terms of revenue mobilization, in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of broader macroeconomic reforms, in terms of budgetary institutions and public financial management. But in any case, what I'm saying here is, at least we have a textbook solutions, policy toolkits. Whether they will work or not, we will discuss them in a moment. But just to give you what are the toolkits we could use. These are the toolkits. Again, in terms of the stabilization one, remember, stabilization according to the OECD is what we are calling the authority of the state, to not look at the macroeconomy only, but to kind of lessen the suffering in terms of human capital, climate, political side, and so on and so on. And here again, we have various policy toolkits. All of them are evidence-based. Again, on the right-hand side, you can see the evidence. In fragile and conflict-affected states, natural disasters are much more harmful than in low-income countries. Climate change, higher propensity, not ready for climate change as well. So we have to stabilize the economy, the society, the human side, the climate, and so the environment, and so on and so on. Now, again, how do we do this, right? I mean, can we use these policy toolkits? So I'm gonna, again, unpack this in a moment, but just for now, we just need to note down, we have policy objective, and on the basis of that policy objective, which is stabilization, we can use policy toolkits like these 4 different clusters of them. None of them, these are many of options. Some of them may be low-hanging fruits. Some of them may be much more harder, but some of them may be quick wins we could do, for example. Number 3 is the most important, which the professor mentioned. We need to protect the weakest and the most vulnerable. We need to show some credibility as you know, in a contested environment, there is credibility deficit. Nobody trusts the state. The state is seen as corrupt. Political actors are not respected. So we need to have some quick wins. Think about Colombia. You know, Colombia recently had a peace agreement, As soon as they had the peace agreement, what did they do? Visible interventions. They started building rural roads. Each time they built rural roads, they would put a big board showing that actually it was the government that has done this, who kind of garner support for the peace building process. So here, what we want to do is we want to implement shock responsive social protections so that we protect people's living standards. We also make sure that we're talking about cash transfers, in-kind support, the low things we can do, community-driven interventions. In Somalia, by the way, what we have been doing is in areas that have been liberated, we have been trying to, for example, collaborate with NGOs, but then make sure that the government gets some of the credit, even though the government doesn't add anything. Again, these are interventions that are very, very important. Why are these important? According to the evidence there, you can see health expenditure in terms of GDP per capita in FCS is practically very, very low relative to low-income countries. Expenditure in social services, again, very, very low. Therefore, what we are saying is social protection, building social, what we call social, some sort of social contract of some sort, showing that the government is doing something is very, very important. This can mitigate some sort of negativity around the state itself. This is what the OECD calls legitimacy, is the hardest, and it's the base of building and overcoming fragility. We're talking about public sector reforms, legal and judicial, basically thinking about civil service training. Why are these important? Because state capacity, as I've done the data there, this is from World Development Indicators, government effectiveness, basic state functions are very low in FCS. Therefore, we want to build momentum. To build momentum is we have to also build systems and institutions. At the end of the day, institutions are basically the rules of the game. They are what overcomes fragility and builds resilience. Basically, it's the foundation. So now, the 4 different policy objectives and the diverse policy tools I mentioned so far are not mutually exclusive. If you can't have one, you can have the other. The idea is everything you can do under these four main domains, do it. The policy toolkits that may work, use them. But then we need to then think about the environment. So what I'm going to do now is dig a bit deeper and mention some really interesting stuff. Because when we talk about resilience or macroeconomic reforms, as policymakers, as economic policymakers, we know that from institutional economics, from elite bargains, from political economy, from incentive structures, we know that this is not easy. Why? If you want to do macroeconomic reforms, and here, what are we talking about? We're talking about, think about revenue mobilization, think about public financial management, procurement, think about systems. These are, even in the most advanced countries, these are very challenging. In low-income countries that do not have fragility and conflict, very challenging. But in fragile contexts, you have unique problems, very unique problems. The biggest one, of course, is the institutional capacity, because the state has more or less been eroded and the institutions have become personalized, and there is usually significant state capture of some sort. Very, very difficult to implement reforms. What you think you can do and the reality on the ground is significantly different. This is what we have discovered in Somalia. Basic things are taking us years to do because of there is elite bargains. Basically, there is some sort of a settlement. There is basically many things that you can't really explain going on basically. Most of these reforms are externally driven. It's usually World Bank or IMF. Therefore, local buy-in is very difficult. They usually disrupt the local dynamics. There is some sort of power sharing agreement. There are many things that you can't see. There is a network. So anyway, what I'm saying is political resistance is there. So how do we deal with these issues? In fragile contexts, you are dealing with many moving parts, and how do you deal with them? On the right-hand side, these are the evidence-based solutions that in practical terms work. So what are we talking about? The first one is you have to pick your battles very, very careful. You have to do things in a very gradual manner, and you have to pick the route of least resistance, right? You have to always understand the political realities before you do anything very complex. This means you're doing things very, very slowly, but this is the right approach. And this is what has worked in many, many countries, unless you have the means. Basically, it's moving the needle rather than basically doing things comprehensively. Every opportunity you get, you make sure you include as many policy stakeholders as possible, particularly key players. This is according to the evidence. Make sure that you do things that are socially sensitive. For example, can you bring many people into the support as many people as possible, and so on and so on. Think, if possible, medium-term stuff. One of the biggest issues you face in fragile contexts is you have no money, right? Literally, the government is not able even to cover its operational budgets. In countries like Yemen, in countries like Afghanistan, in countries like Somalia, over 65% of the government budget, basically recurrent expenditure, right? Forget about public investment. Recurrent expenditure, the government cannot deal. Over 70% of that is reliant on aid. Capacity is very limited, right? Brain drain and things like that. So the idea anyway is you have specific problems, but if you navigate those, it is actually possible. Again, stabilization, because again, you have these problems, you have external interference. The state does not have the monopoly of violence. It doesn't take care of its borders. There is active insurgency sometimes. The government does not have, or the state does not have the systems in place to the due diligence needed to absorb capacity, foreign aid, for example, and so on and so on. So how do you navigate? So these are some of the, according to the literature, some of these things work. But one of the things I want to mention is you have to do your homework properly. You have to start with political economy analysis. Who are the power dynamics? Who are the power brokers? Who are the gatekeepers? If you don't know the gatekeepers, you will just run around like a headless chicken. You will waste a lot of money. At the end of the day, you are not going to stabilize anybody. You will not help with climate, with human capital, with health, and so on and so on. So do your homework, and then you are able to stabilize, at least mitigate, build some capacity in those areas. Number 3 is what we were saying was around social protection and things like that. This is what OECD calls capacity. This is the capacity to deliver, for the government to be seen. But here you have problems. You don't have the infrastructure. You don't have the data. The data is at the hands of World Health Organization or NGOs. The government is literally men in suits. They don't know what's going on. There is a lot of inequity. There is dominance. There is clan dynamics. There is all sorts of problems. So how do you make sure that the government or the state can deliver some sort of visible quick win service delivery, at the same time protecting the weakest of the weak? And some of from Afghanistan, from Yemen, from Somalia, digitization helps, automation helps, because it allows the country to leapfrog. In the case of Somalia, for example, we managed to deliver a national payment system on the cloud, for example, because we couldn't trust, we could not have the infrastructure at home because of the conflict. So we literally have everything, the infrastructure on the cloud, as an example. So you can use digitization. At the moment, over 90% of the civil service have basically, it's automated. Ghost workers, we got rid of it. The same is true in Afghanistan. So you can use technologies. Technology is your friend. Involve community, and so on and so on. You use, because you don't know what's going on, you use geospatial, satellite images, high frequency data, and so on and so on. There are certain things that work. According to the literature, most of these things work. I have some references there. But anyway, the constraints that you face here, there are some solutions. Now, institutional building, which is the hardest, this is which in every country, it has practically failed in fragile context countries because institutions have path dependence. It's very difficult to dislodge. They create some sort of a low equilibrium traps, very difficult to escape. You have fragmented governance structures, elite capture. As you know, the elite, they're busy doing what they need, what they're very good at doing. So how do you manage to do this? So what we have tried to do in Somalia is, again, to have a public FMIS, basically a public financial management system that is automated, that has 7 signatories from the accountant general to the DG of the Ministry of Finance, to Auditor General, to Central Bank, to make sure that there are so many eyes on the system as possible, to kind of make sure that there is a system, some sort of institutional building. Sometimes you can use governance models that are hybrid. That means literally thinking outside the box. What works? Do you have a clan system that works? Can we take some of the good side, the good things from the clan system? Do we have some sort of, do you have a church or a religious authority that works, that is trusted, that has the, and utilize that. Protect the civil service, some of it at least. You cannot protect all of it. Can you create pockets of excellence? In Somalia, that's what we have tried to do, because we cannot, it's very difficult to get rid of many people, because most people have been hired on the basis of clan dynamics. And this is a delicate clan dynamics balance. You cannot really disrupt it. So what you can do is you can move those people with low capacity that have been hired on the clan side, move them, and then can you insulate and create a pocket of excellence, so that at least the core system, the core institutional fabric is protected. That's what we have tried to do within the central bank, within the Ministry of Finance. We have protected some of those. But of course, there is other areas of the state is literally chaos. It's like the law of the jungle. You can't really do. Finally, incremental changes are very important. You cannot change overnight. Things take ages and decades. So basically, incremental changes are very, very important. So now finally, how do you do this? Where do you start? So I want to emphasize, and this is based on rigorous RCT evidence from many, many interventions across fragile and conflict-affected states. We are told that before you do anything, start with your political economy analysis. Who are the power brokers? What are the dynamics? What are the incentive structures? After you have done that, in the short term, start with basic macro stabilization. Basically, protect basic cash management. Later on, you can add, can you build local ownership legitimacy in the short to medium term? And then improve revenue and budget credibility in the medium. This takes about minimum a decade, I'm talking about. And then, of course, budget forecasting, more complex stuff. Public financial management usually is the medium to long term, according to the research. And then, as you are doing all of these things, think about 3 things. Think about protecting lives, basically lessening the suffering of people, investing in resilience. Try to do that, because you must be seen as doing something. Build social contract of some sort. Otherwise, people will hate the government, because they know they will say these people are corrupt, and so on and so on. Make sure you are building some sort of external finance. In Somalia, I was part of the debt relief. We managed to manage over 6 years to get debt relief through the IMF, wiped our sovereign debt liabilities from 68% of GDP to now 4%, because our debt carrying capacity was very low. But as we were doing step 0, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, we were also trying to engage with international financial multilaterals, for example. Adaptive policy is very important. You see resistance, don't push, go, try to engage. You have the time, you have the luxury of time, because fragility is so deep-rooted. So finally, just 5 takeaways that I want to emphasize. This is a very challenging topic, as you can imagine. Fragility is a persistent problem. There is a fragility trap. Many countries will stay in there for many, many years, perhaps decades, according to evidence. Therefore, context-specific economic policies are important. And those policies, if you think about the 4 domains, you cannot think, let me do all 4 of them. Do what works, given the context, given the challenge. Make sure that you try to build institutions as much as you can, and make sure that the locals own it. And when I say the locals, you have to understand what locals mean. For example, I'm an ethnic Somali, born in Mogadishu, but when I go to Somalia, they don't consider me as a local. You understand? So they don't consider me as a local, because they're saying this guy comes from the West. Local means something entirely different. Local ownership means an analysis based on the political economy dynamics. Who are the power brokers? Who are the key people that the gatekeepers, who you can leverage on your team so that you get things done and move the needle slightly? Donors are solution, but they create segmentation, they create duplication, they create silos, they undermine state building. So you have to make sure that you have a country platform or donor coordination mechanism. Somalia is one of the pioneers of donor coordination mechanisms. We insist everything we do. All the donors must sit on one single table, and we try to tell them what to do. We are successful about 50% of the time, because they have the money. We don't have the money. So sometimes they tell you no, but as much as you can, make sure you have that. Local capacity is also important. We have the Somali Trust Fund. Again, you tell all the donors to pool their resources into a trust fund that they manage, but we decide which capacities they can build. So when I was at the central bank, my team was trained using those money. And finally, you cannot copy from Washington or London. You need to think in terms of local, context-specific, conflict sensitivity, adaptability are critical. So most of these policy toolkits are used, but some of them are not used as much. And I'm going to leave it with your esteemed audience to decide which ones. But I'm going to stop it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali, for that insightful and very deep presentation. A lot of things you mentioned, and I want to believe that we already have a lot of hands raised up. There are questions already. Just before we go straight into question and answer session, I just want to highlight some of the things you mentioned. The first thing you said about when you're trying to define fragility, we should understand that it's multidimensional. In its definition, is multidimensional, and the fact that it's the definition of human misery. You also mentioned that, and fragility does not necessarily mean that all countries that face conflicts. So and also you emphasize, which I feel is really important, and is one of the things that within the Nigerian context is one of the major particular or peculiar things that we're looking at. You said the solution should be context specific, and the policies also should be tailored policies. That's very instructive, because we cannot just swallow recommendations from advanced worlds that are not facing the same thing that we are facing. And even the definition of fragility is different from country to country. But I mean, there are so many things that are principles that are applied across board. I must say that was really insightful presentation. So I want to open the floor now, and this how we'll do it. Okay, your hands are already raised. When I call you, you just, all right, just unmute, then ask your question. I think you should be able to unmute yourself. So I think I'll start with Bakari. That's number 1 here on my screen. You can unmute and ask your question if you are able to do that.
So very much. My name is Najimuddin Bakar. I'm a professor here at University of Malaya, Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur. Thank you for giving us the platform to listen to the very insightful take by Dr. Adi. In as much as what he has articulated are very elegant and outstanding in the sense of how do we address the issues in the on the continent of Africa. I have a few comments and a question for him. Number one is that I think we have missed out the structural nature of our problem. And by structure here, I'm not talking about the structure within the state. I'm talking about the systemic structure that is so domineering, which is, in my humble opinion, it is much more than even the domestic fault line. Take, for example, if we look at Libya, how the fault line was actually exacerbated by this structure, the systemic factors which I'm looking at. So I want to say maybe to have a very holistic picture of what Doctor has presented now. Number one, we should start decolonizing the way we look at things. And like you also said, the moderator, the definition of fragility itself is very Western. So I think even when the doctor was presenting, it was on and on, citing OCD. So it seems that our fountain of knowledge, it is not context specific as it tries to portray, but it is much more of an adopted or borrowed issues. Now, my question is this, sir. Given all of this background, and we know quite well that not until the structural issue in Africa is removed, and how can African government, how could they survive if the structures remain there? I mean, the systemic structure, the IMF is there, the World Bank is there, the different players are there to somehow accentuate the domestic problem we have, and still we are talking about policy. So let me put it in another way. What strategy do you think as an African or as an economics or as a political economics can African policymaker strategize to combat the systemic problem, which is drawing back the progress of Africa and perhaps further exacerbating this whole concept of fragility? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doctor, for the question. Very good point. The idea that we need to look this holistically and using the structural dynamics within our own African context, that's a valid point. What exacerbates our situation beyond the structural characteristics is the finance side. Unless African countries create really functioning multilateral financing institutions, we would be facing this problem. The reason why we have to think the way the World Bank and OECD is, because everything that is financed within the continent of Africa are used, this is the framework they use. Given if you read the FCS strategy of the World Bank and the IMF, they're talking about adaptive programming, prevention, financing. And so we have to, because ultimately, unless we create an African Union that has the equivalent to African Bank, even AFDB, African Development Bank, is essentially owned by the West. So you're right, but the starting point is the money, right, and the resources. Because once you have the resources, it's relatively straightforward to decolonize the whole kind of framework. But I completely agree with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. I think your question has been answered. I'll move to Omobolanle. You can unmute and ask your question.
Good afternoon. I am Omobolanle Oladoko. I am a founded level student at the University of Ibadan, and I am also a young scholar at Kingsgate Advisors Institute. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali, for the amazing session. And thanks to Kingsgate for organizing this amazing session as well. So my question is, one of the challenges fragile states face is limited space and difficulty attracting investment. From your work with DFI, sir, and international partners, what innovative financing approaches are emerging to support inclusive growth in fragile contexts?
Thank you. Excellent question. Excellent question. So the development finance institutions, or DFIs, there is over the past 6 years, there has been an attempt to mobilize resources to address fragility. Unfortunately, DFIs are not really interested in fragility, even though they have a public sector, they have a public mandate. As you know, their mandate is to actually help countries achieve economic development, particularly fragile contexts. But their internal structures is such that the bar is so high. Risk appetite is very, very low. The due diligence, the institutional and climate, basically the conducive environment they need is so high. So what we have been doing, so we hold the annual DFI fragility at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford annually. And every year what we have been trying to do is think about approaches that can work. Now, what we have realized is that actually even in fragile contexts, there are business opportunities, but those business opportunities are not known. So one thing that must happen is that a cultural shift must happen within the DFIs, because the DFIs are at the moment risk averse. And the reason why they're risk averse is because DFI, the fragile economies are not really, their voice is not heard, right? They don't go to important places, G20 or G7, and advocate and fight for their God-given right. I mean, they have to, they're part of the global political, the global order. So unfortunately is a fight that we have actually neglected, but I'm hopeful that more and more fragile economies will fight to get more DFI investments into their countries. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you for that. I think that's a well-answered question. I'll move to Abdullah Osman.
Okay, I'm just a young economist from Somalia, currently working for the public sector. So I just wanted to ask His Excellency Dr. Ali for a question, and that is, how can, in the phase of dollarization, how can we balance the dual objectives of delivering services and economic stabilization, where monetary policy's role is limited? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very, very good question. So as you know, in most fragile economies, basic prices have been distortionary, right? So price distortion exists because market failures are significant. Think about normal prices. We're talking about exchange rates. We're talking about interest rates or exchange rates. All of these inflation, big issues. So dollarization actually is a phenomenon whereby, because what happens is depreciation will be significant. So what happens is naturally, for people to survive, dollarization becomes an important kind of solution. Dollarization undermines, of course, monetary authority and so on, sovereignty and things like that. But actually it has some benefits. One of the benefits is that it kind of cushions the economy from uncertainty, but also from inflationary pressures, other than the inflation that comes from import side. Now, how do we overcome this? I think the best approach is that for those countries, dollarization is an intermediate kind of solution. But in the long run, of course, they need to have their own monetary policy. They have to create their own currencies. But if the state has competing priorities, so think about, you have human misery, you have to stabilize the economy, you have to stabilize everything, you have to build the institutions. Given the limited amount of things you have and the lack of capacity, sometimes domestic currency may not be the solution, unfortunately. So dollarization is not a big deal. But in the long run, of course, it's very, very important.
For that, and I agree with you. I think your question has been answered. I have Pascal here. Pascal Messi, would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Okay. Hi everyone. Good evening. My name is Pascal Messi. I work in insurance with Aviva, and I also work as a young scholar with Kingsgate Advisors Institute. Good evening, everyone. So my question is, for Doctor, you've been involved in scaling up investments in energy access in fragile environments. So please, could you tell us why is energy such a critical component for resilience, and how can fragile states realistically expand access despite security and infrastructure challenges? Thank you.
Yeah, very important question. As you know, energy is very, very important, not only for economic development, but also for peace. One thing we don't understand is that unless you have energy, it's very, very, it's very, very challenging for the country. And actually, access to energy is so important, and it has a gender dimension. As you know, females and female-headed households suffer disproportionately from lack of energy. Also, energy also is important because you want to create jobs at the end of the day. One of the easiest escape routes out of fragility is basically job creation, given that you have, in many countries, over 70% of the population would be below the age of 30, and you want to utilize them. This is a resource that you want to utilize. Unfortunately, energy access it requires a lot of infrastructure. It requires a lot of sunk costs associated. You have to front load a lot of costs. So, but there are modalities that work. For example, distributed things like that is very, very helpful. Within the IGC, we have done a lot of work in very challenging environments. We have piloted how do you create viable energy systems. And so far, what we have discovered is that you have to just make sure that you need to start thinking not big, but small, right? Because if you start, the problem we have, if you think about IFC has a large fund, a few $100 billion fund that they want to use for energy access, but they're waiting for the big ticket item. They want big item, right? One $5 billion item. That will not deliver energy to the poorest people in most fragile contexts. So community-related interventions, things that can create momentum, this is what we advocate for. And I think starting thinking basically small technology will be the solution. But energy is a big challenge. Luckily now, there are two interventions, big interventions from the World Bank, AFDB. They're all partnering now. And the biggest item now they have on their agenda is energy access, which is luckily for us.
That's really good to know. That's really good to know. And I believe a lot of interested stakeholders are also taking advantage of those funding to channel it to see that this energy is available to the end users, mostly the most fragile people. So if you still have questions, you can still raise your hand. I think we have one more person. Kachiro Ambro. Kachiro, please unmute and ask your question. If there are other people that want to ask questions, please raise your hand so we can identify you and allow you to speak. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ma. Thank you so much, sir. Hi, everyone. My name is Kechiro Ambromoye. I am from Covenant University doing my master's there. I'm also a young scholar at the Kingsgate Institute. My question goes to Dr. Ali. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, by the way. As someone who has worked in the intersection of policy, academia, and governance as well, what advice would you give to us young economists and policymakers in this fragile context who want to contribute meaningfully to economic transformation?
Yes, thank you so much, Kachiro. That's a very good question. As you know, economics or an economists, they have set tools. They're good, very good analytical mind. They have a vast network of tools. But given that I've been involved in policy making in fragile and conflict affected states, where we lack is political economy, understanding the political economy. If you want to become the best economist, an economist that can make real change in developing countries, you have to revisit your political economy analysis. Without that, your analysis will be literally, you will be using a blunt instrument that cannot cut anything. You would have a hammer, right? And then if you have a hammer, the solution is not good. In my experience, 3 things that work in fragile contexts is a degree of understanding political economy. Number 2, a degree of humility. You know, we don't have all the answers. We have to have a learning mindset. To have a learning mindset and being humble will unlock so many interesting stuff. And I went in 2017, I was a senior lecturer in the UK, doing so many consultancies with World Bank, IMF. I thought that was the best economist. I went to Mogadishu and I realized I didn't know that much because I did not have the humility, the humbleness. My mind was not learning. I didn't want to learn anything because I had the answers. You know, I was the best. I had a master's degree, I have a PhD, I've taught for a decade. And number 3 is the way we sell and communicate. If you cannot communicate complex ideas, you will not be able to become someone that is trusted. You know, in our culture back home in Africa, for you, if you don't know how to communicate with people, you're not going to navigate. So 3 things that I hope all the young economists here: your political economy, the lens that you use should be political economy. It should not be an overlapping generations model or a simple, the modern new classical theory that they used to teach us. That's not going to work. Number 2, a degree of humility, learning mindset, and learn how to communicate in plain, simple language. Otherwise, you're not going to do anything. In fact, you will run home back to wherever you are. You're not going to navigate. Back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir. I like the way you answered that question. You know, we have one more question here from the chat box. I'll just read it out. From Adesoji Faraibi, and he's asking that, in your opinion, what's the best financing model for developing countries? DFI's funding comes with technical requirements and stringent conditions that may not be favorable in the long run. So how do we address that?
No, this is very important. I mean, you're absolutely right. You need, we need resources. You know, fragility is associated with resources. In most fragile context countries, foreign aid is not going those places because absorption is limited, foreign direct investment is not going, portfolio follows are not going there. Debt stress is a big issue, so you cannot borrow, you're excluded. Concessional financing is limited. So all in all, resource is important. Domestic resource mobilization, you can't really rely on that initially because you are overwhelmingly, because of lack of capacity and lack of governance capacity, you are basically relying on extractives, or you are basically taxing a tradable sector. You don't have the capacity to mobilize massively. So what can you do? I think market making is very important. You have to create markets yourself. So if you go to a DFI and tell them, well, we have comparative advantage in energy, or we have comparative advantage in oil, and we have comparative advantage in those things, they will tell you, well, but I cannot come to you because the gulf between where the DFI sit and where the fragile country is significant. So market making interventions are various instruments that are designed to create some sort of, to build a bridge between the two. For example, if you have a sector, if you have an oil and gas sector, if you have any sector you have, do they have the corporate governance that is required? Do they fulfill the due diligence? Do they have audited financial statements? Do they have management practices? And so market making is where we lack. Whenever I go to Somalia every 6, 7, 8 weeks. I go back because I'm a member of the National Economic Council, and I meet these business people. I meet these relatively vibrant business people, even though their ticket size is very small, around 50 million maybe. I ask them, you are very good within Somalia because you are using clan network or religious network, informal dynamics. But to break into the big dynamics, to join the big leagues, you need to do this. You have to build, internal corporate governance. You have to build management practices. You have audited financial statement. Are you appointing your cousins to be CEOs? No, don't appoint them. Do something more. So market making is how we unlock finance. Otherwise, we will be left behind.
Right. Thank you for that. I think, okay, so no more questions there. I want to ask one question, something related to what you do with the IGC. Then I'll call on Prof to give probably a closing remarks. I believe he has one or two comments also that he wants to share. But before then, I know that IGC, you have footprints in certain countries that are vulnerable to fragility and the likes. I know you work with the likes of Ghana. I just want to ask, out of curiosity, if there are plans to extend to Nigeria, if there are plans going on already, and if that is, how do Nigerians in this sense now, private sector, the government and the likes, how do they come into partner with IGC to see possibility of working together?
Thank you so much. A good question. So the International Growth Center is actually a partnership between Oxford and LSE, but we are based at the LSE, and it is practically funded by FCDO. Since 2008, practically 90%, 85% of financed and funded by FCDO, and therefore FCDO programs are what we feed into in terms of policy advice, research, and what we do is we try to bridge the gap between research and policy, make sure that, and then we have 11 countries that across Africa and Asia. Ghana is one of them, and actually they do some regional stuff, but Ghana is the main one and Sierra Leone. I've been to Sierra Leone. I work with them because they have a fragility focus, so I advise them as well. So now in terms of what I do within the hub in London, we have 4 initiatives, big initiatives, and one of them is the State Fragility Initiative. I don't know if you know, the State Fragility Initiative was actually created by an initiative called the LSE Oxford Commission, directed by David Cameron, as well as Paul Collier, as well as Donald Kabaruku. If you remember Donald, the former finance minister of Rwanda, but also he was the boss of the FDB at some point in time. So they created basically so what I do, my initiative, we try to take forward. Mo Ibrahim was part of it as well. So we are trying to take forward the recommendations of that particular council into practice, so that we support countries. So I support countries including Mozambique, Sierra Leone, as well as Nepal, as well as Yemen. My biggest country is Yemen. So what can Nigeria do? I suspect Nigeria will be an important country in the coming, I think in 2 years' time, from what I've been told, I'm hearing, because as you know, FCDO's strategy has changed. Now they want to partner with big countries, and as you know, Nigeria is a huge country, and the current foreign secretary has been to Nigeria. As you know, his first speech. He did it in Nigeria. So I think Nigeria will be an important country going forward for FCDO. And once they become for FCDO, for IGC, they will become. So back to you.
That's really good to know. Thank you very much. So, Prof, if you have comments, maybe you want to just react to some of the questions or general last comments before we conclude this evening.
Oh yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Lanubi. Well, I think it was a very great lecture, and I really want to join others to thank Dr. Ali for this excellent perspective and the very brilliant questions that were also asked. You know, I just think that you know, addressing fragility will also require us to use what they call both kinetic and non-kinetic approaches. Okay, to find a way of underlying to discover what are the underlying factors of this fragility to address them. Okay, until we're able to, you know, peel it, just like we'll talk about the onion. Peel the onion and really look at what is really driving, what is fueling this fragility. Then every other measures may not work. I fully agree with Dr. Ali about important solutions, you know, not being the appropriate thing, just trying to, you know, get, you know, something from the World Bank, the IMF, for some other countries and importing it will not work. There must be a way by which, you know, one look at the specific case, understand the dynamics, the fundamental causes of those of the conflict, and then find a ways of, you know, going ahead to address them. And in Africa, I think it's also very important, which is one of the, you know, what I thought was not, you know, in my view, not fully emphasized in the lecture, or maybe I did not hear, is the issue, is the role of African Union. You see, how can we as a continent come together and solve this problem? Okay, if Africa accounts for over 50% of states, you know, fragile states, you know, and almost 70% at one time or the other of African countries have passed through fragility. What is the role of African Union? What are areas of cooperation and collaborations, and you know, and you know, finance, you know, again, we depend so much on the Western world to finance everything we have to do in Africa. I mean, it's a shame. We are the ones that have the problem, and yet instead of bringing resources together internally, and then we can have something to supplement that, we're always depending on the West, you know, to give us solution. Or now we rush to China to come and build it. You know, we don't want to, you know, in African culture, they say that you have a load to carry, and you stand at Kimbo and say somebody should put the load on your head. It doesn't work. You carry it, and then the person assists you. Okay, so Africa must find a way, and the African Union has a role to play, you know, in trying to bring these leaders together, you know, our leadership styles, inclusive, you know, and this fight over natural resource, again, as a part of the problem that we also have. Natural resources are supposed to be blessing from God to help us finance our development, but unfortunately, they're part of the crisis that we have. So, I mean, it's an excellent thing, and I'm really very much happy that a number of young people are listening today. Those are the future leaders of tomorrow, you know, and there must be a way by which, you know, in their own time, they find a way of resolving some of these issues by, you know, trying to do research now, you know, to uncover, you know, how these issues can be a thing of the past, or at least, you know, minimized significantly in Africa. So it's a great lecture, and I must thank Dr. Ali for his excellent presentation. Thank you.
Prof. Thank you. And Dr. Ali, I also join everyone again to say a big thank you to you. I'll allow you to share your closing words, your closing remarks, and also I want to take the moment also to thank all our Ladies and gentlemen, all our participants, thanks for the questions, thanks for engaging, thanks for sharing your name and where you came from. I can see a lot of comments in the chat box. Thank you for engaging with us. So over to you, Dr. Ali, for a conclude.
Thank you so much, Doctor, and thank you, Professor. Great to be here. I want to thank the participants. They are actually, as the professor said, they are the future, basically. So I hope the webinar was inspirational enough for them to think through these solutions. The slides I've already shared the slides, and two takeaway lessons that I want to or messages that I want to share as well is that when it comes to fragility, unfortunately now, given what is happening in the US and the contraction of ODA, fragility unfortunately will be falling off the radar. That means it will now be falling on us to do more analytical work to kind of illuminate what's going on in fragile contexts, because I think the World Bank and others will go out of fashion, unfortunately, given that the biggest shareholder is the US, and when the US and we have seen what FCDO has done. FCDO has also cut its own budgets recently with regards to aid. So that is one thing that should inspire you to be more engaged in fragility. Second thing is that, unfortunately, fragility is intersectional. It's not one thing that is one-dimensional. It's a multi-dimensional, and therefore it requires a diverse toolkit. It requires not only economists, it requires political scientists, it requires legal scholars, it requires engineers and people that can, so and given the demographics of fragile contexts, most young people in the world will be in Africa by 2050, as you know. So what I'm saying is that we have more reasons to be engaged in fragility and economic development and inclusive economic development than any time in human history. This is what I think is the case. So I encourage you to be more engaged, and this space is very, very important because it's what will be defining your own generation. So thank you so much, Doctor, for the invitation, and a great honor to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, round of applause for that. Thank you, everyone. Thanks once again. And I want to encourage, for those of you that joined us probably some minutes past into the entire webinar, we'll be uploading the webinar on our YouTube page in the coming weeks. So just stay tuned. You might want to follow us on our social media pages just to get acquainted with what we do. So you can check YouTube for Kingsgate Advisors Institute. You can check LinkedIn for the same, Kingsgate Advisors Institute, and you can visit our website. There you can have a deeper dive into some of the works we do. That's kingsgateinstitute.org. And so we look forward to connecting with you all in coming months. And for those of you that sign up for notification, once we have any other program like this, we'll be sure to alert you and let you know. Thank you so much for taking out the time to stay with us throughout the program, and have a good evening, everyone. Bye.